Namaste. Have a seat at the Mystic's Table. I'm Robin, tarot reader, seeker, mystic, witch, and of course, your host for this podcast, where we explore metaphysical topics, the occult, the macabre, and sometimes the downright bizarre. Today, I'm going to be talking about the Angels of Cokeville. This is a true story. It's both chilling and awe-inspiring. The tale involves a deranged couple, an elementary school, and what, by many, can only be described as a miracle. Several books and movies have now been written about the incident. Many faithful believers point to the events of that day as proof for God's existence, angels, or life after death. So what really happened that day? Was there divine intervention? Or perhaps just an uncoordinated attack riddled with mistakes? Or was the fact that all the hostages survived that day just a lucky coincidence? There has been a lot of debate about this topic, and in this episode, I plan to dissect all aspects of this story and find the facts. But first, I want to tell you a little about this podcast. This is the first episode of the show. Although it's not my first experience with broadcasting, I did have a little radio gig nearly 20 years ago now with a show called Proper Criticism. We had a lot of fun on that show, so I'm really excited to be back hosting this new show with you now. I will be doing a weekly podcast. New episodes will be available every Wednesday, so I hope you subscribe and come back next week. The full blog and podcast are always available on our sponsor site, mysticstable.com. The Mystics Table is one of the largest suppliers of metaphysical, occult, and New Age products. With over 7,000 curiosities in stock and free nationwide shipping, head on over and check it out. Episodes of this podcast are also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn. Of course, you can always follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. For the rural town of Cokeville, Wyoming, what started out as a typical Friday would soon turn into every parent's worst nightmare. On May 16, 1986, David Young, his wife Doris, and daughter Penny walked into the Cokeville Elementary School carrying an arsenal of weapons and a gasoline-filled device that appeared to be a bomb. Upon entering the front office, David announced to the staff that this was a revolution. He handed them a copy of his manifesto titled Zero Equals Infinity. Later, it would be revealed that he had also sent copies of his writings to several high-level authorities, including President Reagan. The homemade bomb that David brought into the school on a grocery cart was attached to his wrist with a shoelace. He exclaimed that if he should go down or raise his arm, the entire school would be blown sky high. He forced the helpless office staff into one of the first grade classrooms. David's wife, Doris, proceeded to go from room to room, telling teachers and children that there was a surprise for everyone in room 4. Many of the teachers were confused by this, but they still followed. The couple managed to crowd 136 children and 18 adults into one classroom. This was a classroom with a total capacity for 30 students and one teacher. So you can imagine this was a very tight fit. Once in the classroom, David put himself at the center of the room and began telling the group of terrified children, teachers, and staff that this was going to be a brave new world and that he was leading a revolution. He was demanding $2 million per hostage, what would amount to a total of more than $300 million. He also stated that he was prepared to stay holed up for up to 10 days if needed. Now, by this time, David's daughter Penny had pretty much already realized her dad had lost his freaking mind, and she fled the scene early on, along with 2 other people that had come to the school that day with the couple. David's longtime friends, Gerald Deppy and Doyle Mendenhall, had invested with David in a get-rich-quick scheme. But upon learning of his plan to take the children hostage, they backed out and wanted no part of it. Penny frantically drove to the county courthouse and alerted authorities of the siege at the school. Penny, Deppy, and Mendenhall were never prosecuted in the attack, since they did not actually take part in the siege and instead reported it to the authorities. Back at the school, in the tiny, overcrowded classroom, the fumes from the gasoline-filled bomb began making the children sick. Many of them began to feel nauseous, and some even vomited. Several of the teachers pleaded with David to allow them to open some windows so they might get some air circulating in the room. David agreed. The children were understandably scared, and many were crying. At this point, they had already been trapped in the fume-filled room for more than an hour. One of the teachers noticed that David was becoming more and more agitated by the young students. Fearing that they might set him off, the teacher devised a plan using tape to mark out a square on the floor around David and Doris. He told the children this was a game and they should not cross the magic square on the carpet or they would lose the game. As time passed, the children became more restless. Several of the teachers and children began praying as a way to calm themselves. According to witnesses from that day, this seems like it may have agitated David even more. At approximately 2.5 hours into the standoff, David decided to place the shoelace that attached him to the bomb around his wife's wrist and left for the bathroom. I'm just going to go ahead and say that Doris was in no way the brains of this operation, so his idea was probably not the best. Doris was almost immediately negligent, and in David's absence began carelessly waving her hands, gesturing to the children and teachers as she spoke. In her distracted state, she moved her hand too far, pulling the detonation trigger from the attached bomb. It exploded in an instant, setting her and everything surrounding her ablaze. David returned to the room, seeing his wife engulfed in flames, and shot her. Then he shot himself. The room was filled with fire and smoke. It was an inferno of shrapnel ricocheting off the walls. It became pandemonium inside the school as teachers began grabbing children and hoisting them through the blown-out windows. Many children and teachers were injured with flash burns. 79 children had to be transported to hospitals more than an hour away for treatment of burns and smoke inhalation. One teacher was shot in the back with a bullet lodged within less than a half-inch of his spine. Amazingly, he fully recovered from the injury and returned to teaching within just a few days. Incredibly, all 154 hostages escaped with their lives that day, and other than the mental trauma they endured, were able to go on to live normal lives. The only deaths that day were of the perpetrators, David and Doris Young, and we know that was no loss. In the days following the near tragedy, many children began coming forward with stories of angels in the classroom that day. For many in the small, religiously centered town, this was an affirmation that God had answered their prayers on that day and spared the lives of their children. The population of Cokeville at the time was around 500 residents. It's also located in western Wyoming, a mere 2.5 hours from Salt Lake County, Utah, home of the LDS Church and the nation's largest population of Mormons. Due to its proximity, Cokeville is almost identical in religious demographics. According to statistics listed by bestplaces.net, 64% of the population of the town attends some type of weekly church service, with 55% claiming the Church of Jesus Christ as their religious affiliation. This number is much higher than the nationwide average for religious attendance and affiliation. So many of these children were already pre-programmed, if you will, to believe in the possibility of seeing angels, which would only be amplified in a time of crisis. For those who do not hold strong religious beliefs themselves, this knowledge might make the idea of divine intervention easy to dismiss as nothing more than the regurgitating of religious doctrine by children as a way of coping with the trauma they endured. But there's a lot more to the story. For one, as sick as David Young was, he wasn't stupid. He received his education at Chadron State College in Nebraska, where he earned a degree in criminal justice. He had actually been hired as Cokeville's town marshal in the 1970s, although he was dismissed from this position shortly after his 6-month probationary period. Later, it was discovered that David also had connections with several white supremacist groups, including the Aryan Nation. He had extensive knowledge of explosives and had tested his bomb many times before the attack. Every time, it had worked perfectly, and he was quoted as saying that his bomb would literally set the air on fire. David had been planning this assault meticulously for months. Explosives experts who studied the case confirmed David's description of the bomb. Had the bomb detonated as planned, the likelihood of survival would have been near impossible. The explosion would have leveled that wing of the school. Fortunately, there were several things that prevented the bomb from causing the type of damage that he had intended. The bomb tech that first investigated the site said the explosion appeared to have gone straight up, which was something he could not explain. After further investigations, it was discovered that wires to 3 of the bomb's 5 blasting caps had mysteriously been cut, preventing a complete detonation. Furthermore, the explosive powder that should have lit the air on fire had been miraculously hindered from its deadly purpose, thanks to a leak in the container holding the gasoline. And even though the walls were pocked from shrapnel, no one, not one single person in that room, was hit by any of it. As mentioned, David had been planning this and testing his bomb for some time, months. What are the chances he would have made this many errors on a bomb that he intended to use? And how did the wires to the blasting caps get cut? Furthermore, the sheer number of children who repeated the same experience was fascinating. These were elementary school children who would have been clueless to the physics of the explosion. Although they overwhelmingly reported beings of light surrounding Doris right before the explosion, and at the moment of the explosion, the children said the light beings shot straight up through the ceiling, shielding them from the blast, which, oddly enough, correlates with what the investigators found in regards to the blast going straight up as opposed to out. Now, of course, it stands to reason that the children could have been mistaking the flash of the explosion itself for angels. But many of the children state the angels were in the room with them the whole time, telling them that the bomb was going to go off, but that they would be okay and to stay close to the windows. Also, as the children were asked to describe these angels, they gave descriptions of people who resembled deceased relatives. Relatives they had never met or seen, but they were able to identify them in old family photos. Some children reported being led out by angelic figures who simply vanished after they got outside. The windows being open, helping to dampen the initial blast of the explosion. And the magic square that had been placed on the floor contained the majority of the damage from the blast. Had anyone been within that square, they would have been engulfed in flames, just like Doris. One other fairly peculiar thing from this is some of the pictures from the damaged classroom seem to depict a large, light-colored humanoid figure with wings left on the wall. You can see these pictures yourself on the blog page. I've posted them there for you to look at. There are so many little things that fell into place that day that prevented what could have been one of the most horrific tragedies the country had ever seen. I think it becomes hard for even a skeptic to chalk it up to coincidence. I'm not claiming to completely understand what happened at Cokeville that day, but I personally find it difficult to ignore the possibility of divine intervention on some level. I will leave you to decide for yourself what took place in that classroom. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you come back next week where I will be discussing the satanic panic epidemic that began to spread in the late 80s, continuing into the early 90s, and the detrimental effect it had on peaceful pagans. I'm Robin, and this has been Have a Seat at the Mystic's Table.